What if the real problem with women's basketball isn't hate, sexism, or lack of support, but something way more uncomfortable that almost nobody wants to say out loud? Because just a year ago, a brand new league called Unrivaled was being hyped as the future. A player-first revolution. A smarter model. More money. More freedom. More control. It was framed as proof that women's basketball didn't need saving. It just needed to break free from outdated leadership. The media ate it up. Social platforms pushed it hard. Players spoke like this was the moment everything finally clicked. And then, people stopped watching. Quietly. No outrage. No protests. No dramatic backlash. Just empty space where attention used to be. Ratings slipped. Engagement dried up. Clips stopped circulating. And suddenly, the same voices that were shouting the loudest went strangely silent. No victory laps. No updates. No explanations. So what actually happened? Was Unrivaled sabotaged? Was it misunderstood? Or did it accidentally expose a truth about women's basketball that nobody was prepared to deal with, especially the people running it? Because here's where things get uncomfortable. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at the exact same moment one player was pulling all the oxygen out of the room. One story was growing. One name was driving real demand. And everything else suddenly felt optional. And once fans realize something is optional, they move on fast. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Unrivaled wasn't just another failed experiment, and why its collapse sent a warning signal that could reshape women's basketball for the next decade. But to understand how it fell apart this fast, you first have to understand what it was trying to be. Unrivaled didn't launch like a small side project. It launched like a statement. This wasn't supposed to be just another off-season league. It wasn't pitched as a casual exhibition or a fun alternative. From day one, Unrivaled positioned itself as the smarter version of women's professional basketball, a league built by players for players, without the limitations of traditional leadership. The message was clear: the old system was holding women back. Unrivaled was co-founded by active WNBA stars who weren't just lending their names, they were running the show. Ownership, branding, decision-making. This was supposed to be proof that players understood the game, the audience, and the business better than executives ever could. And on paper, it sounded perfect. Shorter games. A 3-on-3 format designed for speed and highlights. Higher pay relative to time commitment. A clean, modern image. And most importantly, control shifting away from league offices and into the hands of the athletes themselves. The media framed it as overdue empowerment. Articles praised the vision. Analysts called it innovative. Social media treated it like a long-awaited breakthrough. The idea that women's basketball could finally break free from what critics called outdated leadership was incredibly appealing, especially to fans who believed the sport had been underestimated for years. And early on, the curiosity was real. People tuned in to see what this looked like. Clips circulated. Discussions popped up. There was a sense that Unrivaled wasn't just trying to coexist with the WNBA. It was quietly challenging it. But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Hype and demand are not the same thing. Hype is loud. Demand is consistent. Unrivaled relied heavily on the idea that fans were hungry for more women's basketball at any time, in any format, as long as the players were in control. The assumption was that interest in the WNBA automatically translated into interest in every adjacent product connected to it. That assumption turned out to be dangerous. Because what Unrivaled underestimated wasn't criticism, it was indifference. The league leaned hard into the narrative that it represented progress, that supporting it was almost a statement of belief. And for a brief moment, that worked. People showed up to see what the noise was about. But once the novelty faded, something became obvious very quickly. Casual fans weren't emotionally invested. There were no long-standing rivalries. No seasons worth of history. No must-win games. No stakes that carried over week to week. And while 3-on-3 basketball is fast, speed alone doesn't create attachment. Basketball fans don't just watch movement. They watch meaning. Unrivaled asked viewers to care before giving them a reason to. And that's where the cracks started to form. The league's strongest selling point, player control, also became its biggest vulnerability. Because when players position themselves not just as athletes, but as executives and cultural leaders, expectations skyrocket. Fans don't just evaluate the games. They evaluate decisions, messaging, direction, tone, and slowly, subtly, Unrivaled stopped feeling like a bold alternative and started feeling like an experiment that hadn't figured out who it was for. Was it for diehard WNBA fans? Casual sports viewers? Activist supporters? Basketball purists? New audiences? The answer wasn't clear. And when audiences are confused, they don't complain, they disengage. That disengagement didn't explode overnight. It didn't trend. It didn't spark outrage. It just showed up in the numbers. And once the numbers started slipping, the entire narrative began to wobble. Because if Unrivaled was truly the future, why did it feel like people were already looking past it? And that question leads directly to the moment everything changed, when another force entered the picture and quietly redefined what fans were actually showing up for. And that's where the Real story begins. At first, the numbers didn't look alarming, at least not if you wanted to believe the story being told. When Unrivaled launched, the initial viewership was framed as a success. Headlines focused on interest, engagement, momentum. Media personalities talked about strong debuts and promising starts, even though the actual figures were already telling a quieter, more complicated story. Because here's the thing about modern sports audiences. Curiosity shows up once. Commitment shows up repeatedly. Unrivaled got curiosity. What it never fully secured was commitment. As weeks passed, the decline became impossible to ignore. Live viewers dropped. Social media clips stopped spreading organically. Conversations that once felt enthusiastic became defensive, or disappeared entirely. And that silence was the most revealing part. There was no scandal driving viewers away. No controversy forcing people to turn off their TVs. No coordinated backlash. Fans didn't rage quit. They didn't protest. They didn't argue in comment sections. They just didn't come back. That's the kind of decline leagues fear the most because there's nothing to fight against. You can't argue with apathy. You can't debate disinterest. You can't shame people into caring. The league had been marketed as revolutionary, but the product itself felt weightless. Games happened, but nothing carried over. Wins didn't matter beyond the night they happened. Losses didn't sting. There were no standings fans checked the next morning. No storylines that demanded follow-up. Basketball without consequence is background noise. And while hardcore supporters tried to frame declining numbers as growing pains or misunderstood metrics, casual viewers made a much simpler judgment. This doesn't feel necessary. That's when the media tone quietly shifted. Instead of celebrating Unrivaled's growth, coverage thinned out. Instead of constant praise, there was strategic silence. Segments that once hyped the league moved on to other topics. Social feeds that pushed every highlight suddenly found something else to amplify. And when a league stops being defended loudly, it's usually because the people closest to it know the momentum is gone. What made this even more awkward was the comparison point sitting right next to it. At the exact same time Unrivaled was struggling to hold attention, women's basketball wasn't collapsing. Interest wasn't disappearing. Viewership wasn't drying up across the board. It was concentrating. Fans weren't rejecting women's basketball. They were choosing very specifically what they wanted to watch. And that exposed a hard truth Unrivaled never planned for. Attention isn't evenly distributed, no matter how fair you want the system to be. One game could pull massive numbers, while another barely registered. One storyline dominated discussion, while others faded instantly. And the more obvious that contrast became, the harder it was to pretend Unrivaled's drop-off was just a temporary dip. Because if demand truly existed, it would have shown up consistently. Instead, the league relied heavily on messaging to explain away what the audience was already saying through behavior. Phrases like long-term vision and building something bigger started replacing concrete evidence of growth. That's usually the moment when fans sense disconnect. Sports viewers are ruthless, but they're also honest. They reward what excites them and ignore what doesn't. And Unrivaled hadn't given them a reason to emotionally invest beyond the idea that they should. But sports don't survive on obligation. They survive on obsession. And Unrivaled never became obsessive viewing. As the weeks went on, another problem surfaced, one that made the decline even harder to recover from. The league wasn't just losing viewers. It was losing narrative control. Because while Unrivaled struggled to define why it mattered, something else was happening elsewhere in women's basketball. Something that rewired fan attention entirely. And once that shift happened, there was no going back. Because when fans find something that feels electric, everything else suddenly feels optional. And that's when the Caitlin Clark effect stopped being a talking point and started becoming a problem. What happened next wasn't planned by any league office, marketing team, or media strategy. It wasn't coordinated. It wasn't engineered. And it definitely wasn't convenient. Because while Unrivaled was trying to convince fans that women's basketball needed a system-wide revolution, one player was doing something far more powerful. She was creating undeniable demand without asking anyone for permission. Caitlin Clark didn't just attract viewers. She reorganized attention. Suddenly, women's basketball wasn't being consumed evenly. It was being consumed selectively. Fans weren't tuning in because they believed in the mission. They were tuning in because they didn't want to miss what might happen next. That difference is everything. Clark games became appointment viewing. Not because of messaging, but because of moments. Deep shots. Late-game drama. Records falling. Crowds reacting in real time. Clips spreading without being pushed. This wasn't a campaign. It was gravity. And gravity doesn't care about fairness. The uncomfortable reality was that Clark exposed a truth many people didn't want to admit. Interest in women's basketball wasn't as broad as it was portrayed. It was concentrated around compelling stories. And when fans had to choose between a game that felt historic and a game that felt experimental, the decision was easy. Unrivaled didn't lose viewers because people hated it. It lost viewers because something else felt more important. That distinction matters. Because if fans had abandoned women's basketball entirely, Unrivaled could have blamed culture, bias, or media neglect. But that's not what happened. Viewership surged in some places and collapsed in others. That's not rejection. That's prioritization. Clark's rise also shattered a long-standing assumption within the sport. That success would come from collective branding rather than individual stars. For years, women's basketball had been marketed as a movement. The idea was that fans would support the league, the cause, the mission. But Clark flipped that script by reminding everyone how sports actually work. Fans follow stories. They follow rivalries. They follow greatness. They don't follow spreadsheets. As Clark's visibility exploded, everything else was measured against it. Broadcasts felt quieter by comparison. Games without stakes felt slower. And experimental formats suddenly felt unnecessary when real drama was unfolding elsewhere. That contrast was brutal. Unrivaled was selling the idea of empowerment. Clark was delivering the experience of entertainment. And entertainment always wins. What made this even harder for Unrivaled was the timing. The league didn't have the luxury of patience. It launched into a moment when attention was already being pulled in one direction. And once fans form habits, they rarely break them for something unfamiliar. Instead of building alongside Clark's momentum, Unrivaled found itself competing with it. And no offseason league, no matter how well-intentioned, wins a fight for attention against a cultural phenomenon. But the biggest issue wasn't competition. It was comparison. Because Clark didn't just raise expectations. She exposed how little tolerance fans have for products that don't feel urgent. If a game doesn't matter, people notice. If a moment doesn't feel special, they scroll past it. And suddenly, Unrivaled wasn't being judged on what it promised. It was being judged on how it felt compared to what fans were already watching. That's a losing battle. As Clark continued dominating headlines, Unrivaled's biggest selling point, player leadership, started to draw a different kind of scrutiny. Because once attention shifts, people stop listening to slogans and start questioning decisions. And that's when another problem surfaced. A problem that had nothing to do with basketball quality and everything to do with power. Because when players stop being just players, the rules change. And Unrivaled was about to find that out the hard way. Unrivaled didn't just ask fans to watch a new league. It asked them to accept a completely new power structure. This wasn't ownership backed by distant investors or retired legends. This was active players stepping into executive roles while still competing in the very system they were challenging. And while that sounded empowering on the surface, it created a tension that became impossible to ignore once momentum slowed. Because when players become decision-makers, they aren't just judged on performance anymore. They're judged on leadership, priorities, and consequences. And fans notice fast when those lines blur. In traditional sports leagues, responsibility is fragmented. Players play. Executives decide. Commissioners absorb criticism. When something goes wrong, blame has somewhere to land. Unrivaled removed that buffer. Every scheduling choice, every media statement, every financial decision became personal. Not symbolic, personal. And once that happened, The league stopped feeling like a collective experiment and started feeling like a test of credibility. Could players really build something stable while still navigating their own careers? Could they balance personal interests with long-term vision? Could they separate competition from negotiation? Those questions wouldn't have mattered if Unrivaled had been thriving. Success forgives complexity. But when viewership dipped, those questions became unavoidable. Because at the same time Unrivaled was positioning itself as an alternative to the WNBA, many of its leaders were still deeply embedded in WNBA labor discussions. That overlap created optics the league never adequately addressed. To fans, it looked messy. Not illegal. Not unethical. Just confusing. And confusion is dangerous when you're asking people to trust you. Casual viewers didn't understand who Unrivaled was really for. Hardcore fans didn't understand how decisions were being made. And critics didn't need to exaggerate anything. The structure spoke for itself. Instead of clarity, there was defensiveness. Instead of transparency, there were vague reassurances. Instead of confidence, there was over-explaining. That's usually the point where audiences sense instability. The league wanted to be seen as bold and disruptive, but disruption only works when it produces results. Without results, it starts to feel reactive. And here's the part Unrivaled never accounted for. Fans don't emotionally invest in power struggles. They invest in outcomes. They don't want to decode internal politics. They want moments they can't stop talking about. But Unrivaled's narrative increasingly revolved around process rather than payoff. Who was in charge? Who deserved what? Who was being misunderstood? That's insider language. And insiders don't drive mass viewership. The more the league leaned into its structure as proof of legitimacy, the more it alienated viewers who just wanted compelling basketball. Because empowerment as a concept doesn't translate automatically to excitement as an experience. Sports fans are simple in one way. If it feels complicated, they disengage. And Unrivaled felt complicated. By trying to be a statement, a solution, and a challenge all at once, it never fully locked into being a spectacle. And without spectacle, even the best intentions fade quickly. As the weeks went on, another shift happened, one that made the league's leadership problem even more visible. The media, which had once amplified every announcement, started stepping back. And that retreat sent a signal louder than any criticism ever could. Because when coverage fades without explanation, it usually means the story no longer sells. And once that happens, leagues don't just lose viewers. They lose protection. And that's when Unrivaled found itself exposed to something far more damaging than backlash. Indifference paired with scrutiny. And that scrutiny was about to turn toward the people who had hyped it the most. At first, the coverage was loud. Every announcement from Unrivaled felt amplified. Every quote was framed as historic. Every early game was treated like proof that a new era had arrived. The league wasn't just being reported on, it was being endorsed. That's an important distinction. Because when media outlets cross from observing into validating, they become part of the story. And once that happens, walking things back becomes awkward. So instead of addressing what was happening in real time, the media did something far more subtle. It moved on. There was no press conference announcing a change in tone. No public admission that expectations had been inflated. Coverage didn't turn hostile. It simply thinned out. Segments disappeared. Articles slowed. Social posts stopped leading with Unrivaled highlights. And when the league did appear in conversation, it was framed cautiously, stripped of the certainty that once surrounded it. That silence spoke volumes. Fans are smarter than people give them credit for. They notice when enthusiasm evaporates. They notice when praise turns into avoidance. And once that happens, trust erodes quickly. Because if something is truly thriving, it doesn't need protection. Unrivaled's biggest problem wasn't criticism. It was that the people who once defended it stopped defending it publicly. And that left the league exposed to a new kind of judgment, comparison without commentary. When fans compared Unrivaled to other women's basketball products, the contrast wasn't flattering. Games felt less urgent. Coverage felt thinner. And the idea that this league represented the future began to feel like a stretch rather than a certainty. The media didn't cause that perception, but it failed to correct it. Instead of interrogating why numbers were dropping, outlets leaned into abstract language. Long-term vision, early-stage development, building something sustainable. Those phrases might reassure investors, but they don't excite viewers. And here's the risk of that approach. When media narratives drift too far from audience experience, credibility collapses. Fans who tuned in and felt underwhelmed didn't want to be told they were watching history. They wanted to know why the product didn't match the hype. But that conversation never fully happened. So fans filled in the gaps themselves. Some concluded the league was overhyped. Others decided it wasn't meant for them. And many simply stopped paying attention altogether. That disengagement had ripple effects. Sponsors pay attention to momentum. Broadcasters track trends. Algorithms respond to interaction. When engagement drops, everything else follows. And once the media stopped pushing Unrivaled aggressively, the league lost its biggest amplifier. Without that megaphone, it had to stand on its own merit. That's when the cracks became impossible to ignore. Because stripped of narrative support, Unrivaled wasn't being evaluated as an idea anymore. It was being evaluated as entertainment. And entertainment is unforgiving. It doesn't care about intent. It doesn't care about messaging. It cares about how it feels to watch. If it feels slow, viewers leave. If it feels empty, they don't return. If it feels optional, they forget about it. And that's exactly what started happening. What made this even more dangerous was what unfolded next, because while Unrivaled was losing narrative control, another conflict was building behind the scenes. One involving money, leverage, and expectations. And once that entered the conversation, the league's problems stopped being theoretical and started becoming structural. Every sports league eventually reaches the same crossroads. It doesn't matter how inspiring the vision is or how progressive the messaging sounds. At some point, everything comes down to one question. Who actually has leverage? Unrivaled entered the conversation around pay, ownership, and player value with a lot of confidence. And on the surface, that confidence made sense. The league positioned itself as proof that women's basketball players were being undervalued by traditional systems. Higher pay per game, more flexibility, more control. It sounded like leverage. But leverage only exists when demand is undeniable. And that's where things started to unravel. As Unrivaled's viewership softened, the league's financial positioning became harder to justify publicly. Fans began asking quiet questions. Not aggressive ones, practical ones. Who is funding this long-term? How does this scale? What happens if attention doesn't grow? Those questions didn't have clear answers, and ambiguity is dangerous when money is involved. At the same time, conversations around player compensation across women's basketball were heating up. Demands were being discussed. Expectations were being raised. And Unrivaled was often cited as evidence that players deserved more across the board. But that comparison came with a hidden risk. Because if Unrivaled struggled to sustain viewership, it weakened the very argument it was supposed to strengthen. Instead of proving massive untapped demand, it suggested that the market was more fragile than advertised. And fans noticed the disconnect. It's one thing to argue players deserve more. It's another to argue it while the product struggles to attract consistent audiences. Viewers don't side with spreadsheets. They side with experiences. If fans feel entertained, they support growth. If they feel preached to, they disengage. Unrivaled drifted dangerously close to the second category. The league leaned into rhetoric about value without delivering enough moments that felt valuable to watch. And once that perception takes hold, financial arguments start sounding like pressure instead of persuasion. That's when leverage flips. Instead of viewers needing the league needs viewers. And when that dynamic becomes obvious, power shifts fast. Sponsors become cautious. Media coverage becomes conditional. Support turns into wait and see. And suddenly, bold demands start feeling risky. This wasn't just about Unrivaled anymore. It was about what the league represented within the broader ecosystem. If a player-run league couldn't maintain momentum with every advantage stacked in its favor, what did that say about the sustainability of aggressive financial posturing elsewhere? That question made a lot of people uncomfortable, because it challenged a comforting narrative, that support alone would close every gap. Support helps, but demand decides, and Unrivaled hadn't proven demand at scale. That realization reframed everything. What once looked like confidence started to look like a gamble. And that gamble placed pressure not just on the league, but on the entire structure surrounding women's basketball. Because when expectations outpace reality, something eventually snaps. And the next shift didn't come from critics or outsiders. It came from fans themselves, slowly realizing what they were being asked to support and deciding whether it was actually worth their time. And that realization leads directly to the harshest truth of all. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable, because it doesn't blame anyone, and it doesn't flatter anyone either. Fans don't watch sports to participate in debates. They don't tune in to validate business models. And they definitely don't stick around out of obligation. They watch because something pulls them in. That pull can be a rivalry, a superstar, a comeback story, a moment that feels like it might become history if you look away for even a second. When fans stopped showing up for Unrivaled, it wasn't because they were angry. It was because they didn't feel pulled. And that distinction changes everything. Unrivaled leaned heavily on the idea that fans wanted to support women's basketball as a cause. And many people do care about growth and fairness and opportunity. But caring abstractly isn't the same as carving out time on a schedule. Time is the real currency. Every game Unrivaled asked fans to watch was competing against everything else in their lives. Other sports, other entertainment, other commitments. To win that battle, a league has to feel urgent. Unrivaled rarely did. The games weren't bad, but they didn't feel necessary. There was no sense that if you missed one, you'd regret it tomorrow. No moment where social feeds exploded and made people say, "I can't believe I didn't see that live." Fans want stakes, even small ones. They want tension. They want consequence. They want to feel like something is building. Unrivaled felt static. And that's the quiet killer of modern sports content. If it feels the same every time, people drift. They don't rage post. They don't complain. They just stop checking. Meanwhile, elsewhere in women's basketball, fans were reacting emotionally again. Cheering, arguing, celebrating, sharing clips at a pace that algorithms love. That contrast revealed something critical. Fans weren't rejecting women's basketball. They were rejecting anything that felt diluted. They wanted excellence, not symbolism. They wanted drama, not explanations. They wanted stars who felt larger than the league, not leagues that asked to be supported first. And once that preference became clear, Unrivaled's identity crisis deepened. Because it didn't know whether to lean harder into activism, innovation, or pure competition. Each option pulled the league in a different direction, and fans sensed the indecision. Sports audiences are intuitive. They know when something is trying too hard to justify itself. The most successful leagues don't explain why they matter. They make you feel it. Unrivaled never fully crossed that line. Instead of becoming must-watch, it became optional viewing. And in today's attention economy, optional is the same as invisible. That realization reframed the entire conversation around the league. Because once fans decide something isn't for them, no amount of messaging brings them back. Which leads to the biggest takeaway of all. Not about Unrivaled specifically, but about what it accidentally exposed. Because this wasn't just a failed experiment. It was a warning. And that warning pointed to a deeper issue no one wanted to address directly. Here's the truth that makes people uneasy. Not because it's cruel, but because it's inconvenient. Unrivaled didn't fail because it was sabotaged. It didn't fail because people were rooting against it. And it didn't fail because women's basketball can't succeed. It struggled because it revealed something nobody wanted to confront. Women's basketball isn't suffering from a lack of opportunity. It's suffering from fragmentation. Too many visions. Too many priorities. Too many parallel agendas competing for the same limited attention. Unrivaled didn't create that problem. It exposed it. By launching as a rival concept, not just a supplemental product, it forced fans to choose. And when fans are asked to choose, they reveal what they value most. They chose urgency over ideology. They chose story over structure. They chose moments over messaging. That choice wasn't political. It wasn't personal. It was behavioral. And once that behavior became visible, the illusion of universal momentum collapsed. For years, growth in women's basketball had been framed as inevitable, like the audience was just waiting to arrive. Unrivaled showed that audiences don't arrive automatically. They have to be earned repeatedly. Every game, every night, every season. What made this so damaging is that Unrivaled launched at a moment when alignment was more important than experimentation. Instead of consolidating momentum, it split it. Instead of amplifying excitement, it diluted it. And in a growing sport, dilution is deadly. The league assumed the fan base was deeper than it actually was. It assumed support would multiply instead of divide. And that assumption led to strategic decisions that looked bold, but turned out to be premature. That's not a moral failure. It's a market reality. Sports ecosystems grow strongest when everyone is rowing in the same direction. when players, leagues, media, and fans feel like they're part of one rising tide. Unrivaled unintentionally pulled in a different direction. And the moment attention fractured, the league lost the only thing that could have carried it through early instability: momentum. Because momentum forgives mistakes. Momentum buys patience. Momentum creates belief. Without it, even the most well-intentioned projects struggle to survive. And that's why Unrivaled's story matters far beyond its own numbers. It's not about one league. It's about what happens when belief outruns demand.